Good morning. Welcome to the second annual, we can actually say it's annual now, the second annual UNCF Career Pathways Initiative convening. My name is Brian Bridges, for those of you who do not know, if we have any new faces in the room since last year. And I'm the Vice President for Research and Member Engagement at UNCF. And it is my distinct and honorable pleasure to welcome each and every one of you individually to this convening, as well as each of your campuses, to what will be a robust and engaging, knowledge-filled 3 days here with your peers, learning about how to drive this work on your individual campuses. For those of you who were here last year, how many hands of folks who survived last year's convening? Okay, quite a few, most of the room. And the main feedback we got from just about everyone was it was so rich, that there was so much information, but whoo, I was tired by the end of it. So once again, I have to commend my colleague Ed Smith-Lewis and the team for pulling together a packed but very engaging convening that I'm sure will leave you energized to do this work, but a little bit more well-informed to do it as well. I want to, before I start, as the person who oversees the Career Pathways Initiative within UNCF, I want to give a big kudos and shout out to the team. For those of you who've been working with Ed Smith-Lewis, the director, and Samad West Keys, our workforce strategist, and Darrell Ann Lifang, and Isidra McGlone. Oh, Darrell Ann Watkins, I'm sorry. Darrell Ann already called me out. She got married. So would the four of you come in here and everyone show your hands? Darrell Ann, Isidra? Okay, Isidra's busy. You all know these voices. You will see their faces a lot over the next couple of days, and they are the ones who drive this work on a day-to-day basis. So please feel free to seek them out, or any one of us here at amongst the UNCF staff. We have some other UNCF staffers here besides myself. I know you will be hearing from our esteemed CEO, Dr. Michael Lomax, here shortly, but we also have in the room our Chief Operating Officer, Early Reese. Early, do you want to stand up, wave? And next to Early is my partner in crime in helping to, in drafting the original proposal, Angela Van Croft, our Director of Development, National Director of Development. And I think that's any other UNCF staffers in here that I'm missing. I think that's it, along with the CPI staff. We do have a couple of other staff. We have Mary Williams, who does recruitment and recruitment for our scholarship programs, and Talia Givens, who is outside at the booth. They will be giving you information on our scholarship and internship programs. But to start things off, I want to talk about the importance, very briefly, of this convening, because there is something to be said about bringing people together to witness to the power of new work and coming together to collaborate, to learn from each other, learn about best practices, get the best ideas together, and help to adjust and adapt things so that it works most efficiently and effectively on your campus. I believe in working smarter and not harder, so why not bring the best minds within the HBCU and PBI community together to talk about how to advance this work and learn from each other, rather than being mired in isolation in trying to get things advanced that we find difficulty in advancing. I want to applaud you for participating in this work. Student success is really at the core of this. I know that some people might say that this is legendary and transformative because of the impact it might have on our institutions and for accountability reasons. However, the center of this all is the success of our students. When this program is successful, more of our students will immediately move into meaningful careers. Immediately upon graduation, they'll walk across the stage with jobs in hand that are aligned with their career pursuits. And so that's what this is all about. And then there are a whole host of other concomitant benefits that will accrue to the institution and to our society writ large. But I strongly believe that this will be a legendary investment that we have to thank the Lilly Endowment for. The $50 million investment from the Lilly Endowment, and I will introduce Sarah Cobb, who will speak in a moment, but I also want to acknowledge Clarence Crane, who has been our program officer and shepherded us through this over the last couple of years. You all want to, I know Clarence is bashful, but Clarence was with us last year, and we want to thank wholeheartedly the Lilly Endowment for this investment, because it would not be, none of this would be possible without the confidence that you have in UNCF and these institutions to drive this work forward. And I do believe that this will be legendary, that in 10, 15 years, people will talk about the investment. Do you remember the CPI project that existed on our campus and how that set us on a new course for career placement and career outcomes, helped us to align our curricula more closely with industry needs? And so I believe that this is the kind of investment that will have legs beyond the next 5 years while we're doing this work on your campuses, but will have residual effects for the coming decades. And so I want to start by introducing our next speaker, Sarah Cobb, who is the Vice President for Education at Lilly Endowment. And Sarah has been at the endowment for over 20 years, and Sarah actually had the opportunity to work on the last big grant that the Lilly Endowment gave to UNCF that was awarded in 1999. That was a $40+ million investment. And so they followed this up with that investment up with a $50 million investment in CPI. And so Sarah is pleased and delighted, and we're pleased and delighted to have her here this year. She could not be with us last year, but she will be here soaking in all the knowledge and discussion that we have over the next couple of days as well. So I want to introduce Sarah Cobb to the podium.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Brian. That was wonderful, setting the stage for this incredible opportunity. Clarence Crane and I are delighted to be here. I'm sorry I missed it last year. He came back to the office and just raved about the conversations and the exchange and some of the actions that have been taken. Again, it is such a delight for us to be here with you on the second gathering. The taglines for this convening, I believe, are especially meaningful. Innovate, educate, motivate. These 3 words are marvelous reminders of the awesome responsibility all of us have as we serve to inspire students and graduates to transition to the world of work. The Career Pathways Initiative is inspiring considerable innovation. Already, there are new ways of doing things, new energy being expended. There are many who need to be brought along by educating to a new way of connecting students and graduates with jobs of the future. And all of us has the opportunity to motivate and ultimately inspire those with whom we work. As you may know, the UNCF Career Pathways Initiative is loosely fashioned after another Lilly Endowment initiative for Indiana colleges and universities. Clarence and I are learning a great deal from those Indiana colleges and universities. We have encouraged change, urging the colleges and universities to embrace new ways to communicate, market, collaborate, and engage. Clarence and I are seeing firsthand this convening's message, innovate, educate, and motivate, being lived out in the Indiana program. Most recently, we have turned our attention to sustainability. We told them last year at a convening, and we will impress the same message upon you. Sustainability must be top of mind. You must be aggressively seeking ways to continue the promising parts of your programs, including institutionalizing within the college or university's budgets, raising funds to cover expenses, and considering some other sort of fee-for-service model, just to name a few. We look forward to participating with you during these next 3 days of conversation. Our congratulations to the UNCF team for assembling a stellar list of speakers. The wisdom, words, and advice you will hear and receive at this convening may challenge your thinking. In fact, it may even make you a little uncomfortable, thinking about things you may need to change in your department, school, college, or university. Change is hard, but we're all in this together, helping to make a difference in the lives of students and alums. Now, I have the wonderful responsibility and pleasure to introduce to you a UNCF summer intern, Sydney Burton, from Boston. Sydney is a rising senior at Spelman College, studying education. She hopes to pursue higher education beyond graduation, perhaps in the area of education policy, in order to pursue better outcomes for other Black students. In her free time, of which I don't expect she has too much, she plays basketball at Spelman on an intramural team. She volunteers in an area middle school, tutoring and mentoring students in the STEM disciplines, primarily math. And she enjoys riding her bike. So, Sydney, I welcome you.
All righty. Well, if you didn't know before, I am from Boston. So again, thank you. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. Sorry. These next few days will be long, they will be exhausting, but they will be enjoyable and fun all the same. During your time here, I hope you are able to collaborate with one another in order to strategize the best plan for your respective institutions, as well as share new information you gain with your respective communities. Here at the UNCF CPI team, and across our member organizations, we're working towards increasing positive career outcomes, not just for the betterment of our students, but for the advancements of our institutions as well. And our keynote speaker today, Jim Shelton, has spent his career doing just that. Whether it be during his current role as president of the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, where he manages education strategy, partnering with educators, communities, and other key stakeholders to produce life-changing learning experiences for the whole child, or during his previous role as president and chief impact officer at U2, Mr. Shelton has held a broad range of management policy roles throughout his career. As a Morehouse graduate who holds a master's degree in administration and education from Stanford University, Mr. Shelton brings a deep-seated understanding of the skills needed to successfully navigate the leadership pipeline, but even more importantly, an understanding of how we can strengthen the pipeline between college and workforce for students like myself aiming to graduate with positive career outcomes. So with that being said, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mr. Jim Shelton.
Make sure I'm lit. There we go. Good morning. All right, thank you, Sydney. Really appreciate that introduction. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes this morning before we get to the interview. Before I do anything, I want to thank Lily. The investment that they're making in HBCUs, I think, is incredible. And as a Morehouse graduate, I can't thank you enough. It's not done often enough. And I know I put crosshairs on myself when I say that from where I sit right now. I want to, you know your institutions better than I ever will. You know how to do your work better than I ever will. And so I thought about what is it that I could share with you today that would be beneficial. And what I want to share with you today is the world as I am seeing it evolve, and what I think some of the implications may be for the work that you're doing. I asked that this be a closed session because I want to be really, really frank with you both now and in my question and answer period. So I appreciate you respecting that. Because what I see is actually a very incredible opportunity, but a potentially scary world. And so I just want to lay it out.
Now here's the good news. The good news is that the paradigm is changing. There is an opportunity that we need to understand. The world has, as we all know, especially the American world, organized around this curve. The curve that says that some people have it, some people don't, some people get it, some people won't. In fact, we built all of our structures around it as well. We all know that median point in the curve. And what I want to argue with you today, I'm not going to argue about whether there's a curve or not. That argument has been had lots of different ways. Is that to say that we don't actually need to argue that point anymore. That in fact, it has been demonstrated time and again that in fact most, meaning 90+%, unless there is a severe disability, have the potential to learn much more than what we are asking of any human being, let alone our kids who are underserved today. So I'm going to pause for a second just to tell you a story, just so you can be clear what I'm talking about. When I was in the administration, the first job I had was running the Office of Innovation, and then later I became Deputy Secretary at the Department of Ed. When I went into the job in innovation, I was obsessed with the military because in my mind, they were the ones who were taking kids that we were failing with in our traditional school systems and teaching them to repair nuclear submarines on the other side of the world. And so I went to find what was the best that they had. And I stumbled across this thing called education dominance, very military name. It turned out to be a partnership between the Navy and DARPA. Now, the Navy has computer systems as complex as any corporation. Think about one of these large destroyers or even an aircraft carrier and the kinds of computer networks that they must now operate. One of the key differences, though, is that when they break, they're thousands of miles offshore. So the Navy was literally spending billions of dollars every year paying for consultants to fly out to solve the problems that the IT professionals on their ships couldn't solve. So they went to DARPA and said, we need computer systems that won't break so often. DARPA said, we can't give you that yet. Tell us about why your people can't solve the problems. And they said, well, you have two problems. One is at about 5 to 7 years, anybody who's been in the service and has built this expertise can make 3 times as much in the private market. They're gone. And our new recruits, they can't solve any of these problems. So DARPA said, let's solve the problem of getting your new recruits to be as good as the people you're losing in 5 to 7 years. That way you'll at least have them. There's a lot of details behind this story, but here's the end. In 18 weeks, they were going to take a typical class of new recruits, 12 high school graduates, 8 GEDs, 2 with any college graduates, no college completers, 1 with any computer experience. That set of students outperformed 7 to 9 year professionals rated as the highest in the Navy on a knowledge test, on performance tasks, meaning they actually pulled real trouble tickets from the ships. And when they were assigned back to their ships, commanders were using their authority to make them in charge of teams. Think about that. 18 weeks. They then figured out how to do that using a digital tutor. They then did it with veterans who were underemployed and unemployed. Most of them, within 90 days, 90+% of them were employed. Average starting salary, $64,000. Top salary, $144,000 in the first cohort. Second cohort, $74,000. Top salary, $144,000. Lesson being, don't take the first job. Right? So, once again, whether we're talking about that kind of example or young kids who have one-to-one tutors proving over and over again that if you give them the right kind of educational experience, they can actually outperform 98% of the kids in a traditionally designed classroom. It is never about the students. It is about whether or not you can provide them with the kind of learning experience that lets them achieve at that level. But we have not designed our systems around what we know about how to do that. And that includes at the higher education level. Now, at Chan Zuckerberg, I'm trying to solve 2 problems. One problem is, on the y-axis, you'll see impact. That's outcomes. That is student outcomes. How do you get the kind of learning and developmental outcomes that are going to shatter what we think our current status quo is? But the second part is, how do you actually get that to go to scale? How do you make that available to everyone? Because we know that we have all these isolated examples of things that people say are best practices or they really work. You hear these miracle stories of individual professors in the programs they run that take students and accelerate them through mathematics very, very quickly, or whatever the course may be. And yet, for some reason, it may not even get around the same university, let alone across campuses. Or in K-12, school to school, district to district, state to state. Oftentimes, we have things that are getting incrementally better, but not at a pace that's actually life-changing. So what we hope to do is to find more of these things, like I described with the tutor, where we can actually dramatically produce different outcomes and then figure out how you scale it. But the other thing that's possible is that as we begin this journey, you can actually learn much more quickly than we do today about what's working and what's not. And by learning more quickly, you can accelerate the pace of improvement. And it's a funny thing, when you work at scale with large numbers, you can learn even more quickly. So we're trying to figure out how do we do a very different kind of R&D, like I described before, to get these breakthroughs, but also how do you use the infrastructure of scale and of technology and data to improve and accelerate the pace at which we learn about learning so we can produce very different outcomes at very large numbers at a very different cost. Now, you guys know these numbers better than I do. Why am I here today with you? Because HBCUs continue to be incredibly important in the landscape. You serve a student population that needs to be served more so than anyone else. You graduate the hardest hit of these students at a rate comparable, if not better, than many other comparable institutions. We still have work to do on graduation rates. We still have work to do on debt levels. And the reality is that in this landscape, transparency around these things, as you know better than I do, is complete. Competition is getting intense. When I have this conversation with majority institutions, with people, it is the same conversation. The landscape of higher education is changing dramatically. I'll talk about an alliance in a second, which includes Arizona State and Georgia State and Purdue University, which just acquired Capital University. Think about what you've seen from Southern New Hampshire, or those of you who know National University. These institutions, nonprofit institutions, are now in the business of scale. They are working really hard at serving well underserved populations. Mitch Daniels, former Republican candidate for president, brags now about his African American enrollment and his completion of African American engineers. Like, it is his primary, you probably know this better than I do, his primary talking point. So the landscape has changed dramatically. The students who people were ready to ignore before, they want them. Their competitive landscape is your competitive landscape, and everyone's got the same issues. We don't know how to serve them as well as they needed to be served, but everyone is now in the game of trying to get better. Now, I bring them up because these institutions, many of them involved in this work, one of the things that I learned when I got to Silicon Valley is this guiding philosophy, this notion that if you try and solve your problems alone, you will never be as good as people who figure out how to engage others. There's a law by a former investor and executive in Silicon Valley called Joy's Law. And it says, no matter who you are, most of the smartest people in the world do not work for you. Think about it. By definition, it is true. But when you think about how you operationalize that, what does it mean I do differently in order to tap those brains that are elsewhere that could be helping me solve my problems? How many of us think about that on a daily basis? When this network was formed, when you thought about how you would collaborate with each other, how did that play into the proposals that you put together? I had the opportunity to look and saw that there were 14 institutions focused on curriculum redesign, another 14 institutions focused on data in particular. I'm curious what the learning is that's going on across those 14 institutions, let alone across the rest of them. I can't imagine that there aren't some similarities in the work that's being done. So you guys, I know, are aware of the University Innovation Alliance. I want to talk about them for a second. They just have one way of being organized, but I want you to just note who's on that list. I talked about them a little bit, and I want you to think about a UT and Arizona State and their scale and the kind of resources they probably have access to. And then I want you to think about the fact that they still decided that they couldn't do this work alone. And that the way that they actually are measuring themselves is the speed of ubiquitous adaptation. So in other words, how quickly will the most effective practice make it across their entire network? So they set themselves up to compare what they're doing with each other, find out who's got the best version of it, and then scale it across the others, recognizing that it needs to be adapted when it goes to the other institutions because context is different. Now, they're not great at it either. But that orientation with institutions working at that scale, that says something about the possibilities for that kind of accelerated work. Now, I know the Education Redesign Lab is here, and they probably know more about this than I can ever. I'm curious what they will say to you about how to think about organizing for this work. I will answer lots of questions today, but there is no more important question than this one. If HBCUs are going to continue to play a role in producing the leaders of the next generation of African Americans and of this country, what needs to happen and how quickly for that to be the case? What I believe right now is that across the sector, we could see a quarter to a third of institutions disappear. I'm not talking about HBCUs. I'm talking about all of them. And so what is it that HBCUs need to do to be among that remaining 60 to 75%? And what is the likelihood that any one of you can do it on your own? And with that cheery note, I'll end.
Well, I'm not too old to make it like that. Good morning, everybody. I didn't get a chance to look at all. I'm Michael Lomax, President and CEO of UNCF. Great to welcome everybody here and to begin today with a conversation with Jim Shelton. So Jim, thank you for being here today. So you said a little bit, I want to sort of get us into this. There are some really hard questions I want to ask you. And like you, I think this is both a lot of opportunity, but it's scary. But before we get into the hard questions and the scary, maybe familiarize people just a little bit more with you. So HBCU grad, Morehouse College. You have gone on to Stanford for a further degree. You've worked in consulting. You have worked Gates Foundation, Obama administration, Department of Ed, Innovation, and then Undersecretary, and now Chan Zuckerberg. That's a lot of experience in a relatively brief amount of time. Just say a word about how you were prepared at an HBCU. How you were prepared and maybe how you weren't prepared for this journey you've been on.
So I still say, in any setting, that my experience at Morehouse is the most important developmental experience I had other than my parents raising me, period, point blank. So to fill in the blanks, I came to Morehouse from DC, grew up in Southeast DC, and wound up going to private school, not with any of the kids from my neighborhood for the entire time. So one of the most important things to me that Morehouse provided right away was I was not by far the smartest kid in my neighborhood, but I had a very different opportunity. And because of that, I also had different aspirations. And so being able to be surrounded by a bunch of brothers and frankly sisters from Spelman and Clarkson University who had the same aspirations, and then to learn that they had such diverse backgrounds, like all black and incredible diversity and things they'd been exposed to and seen, that things I knew nothing about. That powerful experience of being surrounded was the first thing. The second thing was the faculty and the faculty expectations. And what I will say is, though I think I got a good education in my K-12, what I realized is that no one had ever expected me to do really excellent work. No one had ever been dissatisfied with the level of work I was doing. And when I got to Morehouse, well, that changed. There were extraordinarily high expectations, and I was pushed. And because I was pushed, first I failed, and then I succeeded. The third thing is two parts. Now I'll just skip on to the other parts of it. While at Morehouse, I was a computer science undergrad, and but I had exposure to lots of other parts of the college. In fact, I think most people thought I was a business major when I was at Morehouse. But in the computer science department, I had the opportunity to work with a couple of faculty members who were on loan from AT&T was loaning faculty at the time. And with one in particular, I worked with him. He was on the leading edge of, just to date myself, what were at that time referred to as relational databases, which was a big deal at the time. And when I got to my first job, I literally sat down for what they do to you at big companies sometimes in a room for my orientation with two giant binders where I was supposed to go through over the next couple of weeks. And it happened to be the room where they had on the walls the big system they were trying to build. And because of the experience I had had working with that faculty member who was on the cutting edge of this work, I looked at that wall and I said, this is never going to work. And I won't go through the long story, but it turned out I was right. And because of that, I was only at Exxon for 2 years, but I had an extraordinarily accelerated advancement, a huge amount of responsibility as a relatively new person. And it changed the trajectory of it changed my career at Exxon, but it changed my aspirations for myself as well. And then the last thing I'll say on this front, specifically before I even got out of Morehouse, is Morehouse had and has still a orientation that you need to know what you're stepping into. And you need to be prepared for it all the way around. And what I mean by that is that there is we are all aware of the cultural antagonism that happens when you step into a corporate environment. I mean, I remember going to Exxon and as an intern, talking to the guy who was supposed to be my summer mentor. And it was towards the end of the summer, and he said, had been, one of these lunches that they have, and there was food left over. Big fruit plate, and I said, I'm thinking about getting some of that fruit. He said, yeah, I can see you sitting out there barefoot eating that watermelon on the table. And it was me standing there with the head from a consulting firm that was working with them. And I remember having to process that and figure out my response and figure out what I was going to do, given that I was trying to get a scholarship from them to go back to school, and how I could have managed it in a whole range of different ways. Too long a story to tell you how I did. Anyway, so lots of different ways that the Morehouse experience prepared me, but then it carried through the rest of my career. And so when I left that, I came out here to Stanford. I did both business and in education because I knew I wanted to be in education long term. And what it did for me was it let me know when I walked in the room and there were not many folks around to comfort me, I could feel that I was just as good as anybody. And I was prepared for it. And that just kind of carried through my career. I'll just stop there.
Yeah, well, but you've had to, I mean, I want to push this a little bit
Sure.
because a lot of what you've said about the Morehouse experience, I could feel the amens out in the audience. I think that's something that we talk about a lot and we document, that there's a sort of soft side, I don't want to call it soft skills, but non-technical skills, that capabilities that the HBCU experience gives us. But I want to push harder on the expectations around performance that you encountered, and then the expectations you set for others who had to work with you. Because at Gates, no excuses, Department of Ed brought that culture, and now I think at Chan Zuckerberg. So say a little bit about learning to perform at that level.
So, despite my, B-ish performance in high school, I tested really well. And so I was admitted to the honors program at Morehouse. And I remember sitting down with the head of the honors program, a guy named J.K. Haynes, and I thought you might remember that name, and him saying his expectations for what my GPA ought to be in college. And I was like, what? Where would you ever get an idea like that? I've never seen grades like that. And so this began with him, and I can tell you my entire freshman year, my history professor, I was wrote my first exam, and he wrote me a note in the end, which I still have to this day, that says, "You have the potential to be brilliant. You are not yet." And he rode me and worked with me throughout. And what it taught me is several things. One, that I had the seeds of, which is that applied, supported effort with high expectations drives incredible things. And you have to have all of those, right? The idea that there are people out here who work really, really hard against low expectations. And so they do everything they're asked. We see a lot in high school, but I say we see it in college even more so. Let me just put this point in here. We have to remember that our college dropout rate is higher than our high school dropout rate. We don't ever frame it that way, but that's just the fact. And we try and put it on financials, but that is not always the case. So, high expectations, but supported. Not look to your left, look to your right, but an expectation that every single person in that room can meet the expectation that you set for them, even at its highest. Like, that's a belief system change that needs to permeate every part of American culture, including our HBCU campuses. And what I will say is that I love to think about Morehouse providing that for all students. I know I got it differently because I was in the honors program. And I know on a lot of campuses and a lot of schools I go to, you can walk through and feel like almost nobody's getting it. And as much as I like to and am proud of what we can put on the boards in terms of who we serve and how well we serve them, I go, it's not enough. Like it's still not enough. And that's what I think a lot about. So when I am running programs or working on programs, my press is, what is going to be enough? What is going to be enough to actually change lives? And if it's not enough to change a life, many, many lives, then it's still not good enough. And I felt like that was a gift that was given to me, and that's what I try and pay forward.
So, the world you operate in every day at Chan Zuckerberg, as the world you operate in every day did operate in every day at Gates Foundation, is a very exacting world. very high standards, no excuses, and always pushing the boundaries. Is there any way of getting around that in the 21st century?
So, one, what I would say is that relative to one of the things that is true is that we're pretty exacting inside these organizations, but there's no external pressure that makes it happen, right? When you are inside of philanthropy, like, it is self-driven. The rest of the world operates on a completely different thing. I mean, and the thing to remember is, like, before I did this kind of work, I did management consulting, but also started and ran my own company and did private equity investing. And in those environments, and when you're seeing it and hearing it more and more in the news today, it is global. I mean, these are the things you know. It is global, and it is relentless. And you are no longer competing, we can't even say you're not competing with the person next door. Yes, you are competing with people from around the world, but you are now competing with robots and AI. And it is not just changing truckers' jobs. It's changing accounting. It's changing medicine. It's changing everything. And the fact of the matter is, if you have kids in high school, you don't have any idea what kind of job they should get when they finish college, because the jobs are going to be entirely different, and there are going to be less of them. So the big question is, I mean, not how relentless is it inside of an environment like Chan Zuckerberg. It is, what is the rest of the world going to be like? And in what ways will people be able to distinguish themselves? And how will they be able to survive when things are changing at the clip at which they're going to change? And so the good news for HBCUs is that I remember going to my mom's office when I was a kid to try and catch a ride home from school, and there's just this one lady that had a sign behind her desk that had clearly been there for like 20 years. And it said, "We, the willing, led by the unknowing, have been doing so much for so little, for so long with so little. We are now qualified to do anything with nothing." and what I will say is that HBCUs have figured out how to take limited resources, students who are coming underprepared, and a hostile at times environment, and do incredible things. And now it is more necessary than ever. It's going to take some hard self-reflection, because you can look at the numbers and be proud of what you've done and just say just what I just said. It is not enough.
Okay.
And you can look below the numbers, and you know better than I do what's not anywhere near as good as it even should be. And then you have some hard decisions to make, because right now, many institutions have had the luxury of being able to dabble in lots of things. It is kind of the way of the liberal arts university, if you think about it. And the reality is, it's really hard to be excellent at a whole lot of things. And so people are going to have to figure out, what are we really going to be excellent at? And if we're not excellent at it, but we still need it, is there somebody else who's excellent at it that we can bring in to help us, or to partner with, or to develop it together? That's a different way of working. And if you think about it, like, that is what we were talking about your daughter before you came in. That's the world that our young people have to go into. Like, the world is changing around them. They find and are seeing opportunity. They are finding and seeing people who may be able to help them. They're making those connections when they can, or they're putting themselves with other people who have the connections when they can't, in hopes that it's going to show up. And as institutions, like, we have to make that same kind of leap. And what I will say is, the opportunity is, because we have to leapfrog everyone else. Because they're still trying to figure some of this stuff out. But they're coming so fast.
So it's this pace of change is incredible. We begin with certain kinds of assets at HBCUs. We they are necessary, but they are not sufficient. So let's begin with being choiceful, because you can't be excellent at everything. So what role does planning and design play in making these moves in the right direction?
I mean, it is everything. The biggest thing is always execution, but especially when working in environments that have limited resources, like planning and design are everything, because you don't get to redo over and over and over again unless you design a system that's meant to work that way. So here's what I mean by that. So one of the nice things about being in Silicon Valley is that you get to meet all these entrepreneurs who are either in very small startups, or they have a big company like Mark has now with Facebook, but it started somewhere. And what you learn very quickly is that their mentality is start. Like, if you have a hard problem, yes, I want to think really well about it and pick the very right place to start, but start, because that's the way you figure out what is actually going to be hard. And then you have to be willing to iterate as quickly as possible. And you have to be willing to fail. And so now the new word is pivot. Actually, it's not even new anymore. It's the old word. The old word is pivot. And all that means is that did not work. I got to do something different. And what I will say is that you see these folks winding their way through to the right answer.
Yeah.
And then feeding it with tons and tons of data about what's working. But at the center of it all is this, they would not call it a planning process. It is very much a planning process that is informed by tons and tons of data, a very, very intense way of interrogating the users or the customers to figure out what is it that worked for you, that didn't work for you, that you wish you had, that you didn't have. All of those things, they call it human-centered design. That is just a way of life. They don't even think about it anymore. And starting at that place with the customer or the student at the center, and then working everything else from there to say, how do I make that experience successful for them? Because if I make it successful for them, by definition, we win. Like, all the effort goes there. And then at some point, they figure out they also have to figure out how to make money while they do that. And then they do both.
So this was a kind of a preview and maybe a commercial for the design work that we're getting ready to do, because it is student-centered. So we're where we should be there. Talk a little bit about data.
So, when I showed that chart with the lines on it, you notice there was that one that had the inflection point. So here's what happens, and and once you kind of understand it, a lot of these businesses make even more sense to you. People think about technology in terms of the access it can provide and the algorithms to personalize things to you. Especially when it comes to learning, one of the things that it does, it provides radical transparency. Like, when someone is learning something and they're using a technology platform to do it, you have transparency to not only what the outcome was, but what the process was. What that allows you to do is to understand how people are learning at an incredible pace. So the first application of data is the simple one, which is nowadays I can, and people have multiple versions of this, have a predictive algorithms, they call it. Basically, it's the data to tell you, should I be worried? Early warning systems. Should I be worried about this student? That they are running into financial trouble, that they are going to run into academic trouble, that they are feeling isolated or going to be isolated. And they can pick up from the data very, very quickly who is at risk and intervene. And when I say quickly, I mean weeks into the year, not after trouble shows up after the first semester, not after they couldn't come back because they couldn't get their financial aid together, not after they withdrew because they didn't feel like they had any friends, or they failed 2 of their core subjects. Before. that's like brass tacks. Like everybody's going to have that capability very, very soon. The next level, though, is the iterative process of data. First one is inside a classroom. Carnegie Mellon spent a decade now ago, did this thing called the Open Learning Initiative, where they challenged, as a part of the Center for Academic Transformation, to design courses that would perform at least as well as the traditional course at half the cost. They designed for that, and they succeeded. And they figured out three things that were really important. One was they did blended, so that students were doing some of the work offline. That was important because of what happens inside of a regular classroom. How many times is somebody going to raise their hand to ask the same question? How many times does a faculty member keep moving even though half the class had no idea what was going on? So allowing people to engage personally with it and then repeat it as necessary, first step. Second is they do that before they go to class. So what happens? The student knows better what they know and don't know. The faculty member now knows better what they know and don't know. So I come into class and I've got a set of students. I now have a way to say, okay, nobody understood what I said last week. We're going to do this again. Or there's 10 of y'all in here that didn't get it, but there's at least 15 who really got it. I'm going to organize small groups so you can actually help each other. How often do you know of or think of that happening and people using data in that way? And the last thing I'll say is that what you are then able to do is take that accumulation over time and figure out which faculty members and which courses are actually more effective than others. Which segments of which classes are actually better than others if you're using common assessments.
And this kind of use of data, predictive analytics, in real time, is what that alliance.
That's their first thing.
That's their first thing. So what we used to do intuitively, maybe if we were small institutions, we know our students, they are doing cognitively and analytically and with data.
Yeah.
And using what they're learning to inform their practice and testing it and iterating on it and improving it and moving at a pace of change which is
in some cases extraordinary.
Extraordinary.
Right. And so, I mean, what's really interesting is I'm supporting this work because there's a body of science around learning and development. And it very clearly says that all of these things that we know about, the other things that get in the way besides academics of students being successful, you have to attend to them. And when you attend to them, you can deal with some of the interdependencies that have been inhibiting academic progress. Okay. There are scientific frameworks for that. There are ways to assess it. There are ways to track data around it. And there are ways to teach people to intervene.
So one of the things I heard you suggest is that when you looked at the information about the folks in this room here, and their work falls into two categories. One was data, they're making, or part of their work, and then the other part is curriculum. For us to get the maximum out of what we are doing, I heard you suggest potentially that we push ourselves more toward data that can go across, or at least understanding how to apply data across all the institutions, and the kinds of curricular reforms, so that we're not just learning that as individuals, we're learning that, or individual institutions, we're learning that across this entire initiative.
And what I would say is, I would say that, yes, like the ability, as you all know, data systems are incredibly expensive. The likelihood of implementing them well is relatively low. That's why people build enterprise systems that can scale across multiple institutions. Each institution trying to figure out how to do that on their own is probably the lowest probability of success strategy that there is. And it doesn't mean that you can't still innovate on top of what everybody is doing collectively. But there are particular things that are very difficult. On the curriculum front, I'm talking to one of these universities, and they're talking to me about their academic genome and how they're mapping what students need to know to the industry. And I'm like, well, are you doing that with the other universities, these universities? Because I'm like, why would it be different to know, why would what a data scientist needs to know be different in Arizona than in Georgia? It might be a little bit different, but the base is going to be the same. So if I'm saying it to them, why would it be any different here? And in fact, I'm not just saying encouraging it for connecting with each other. I'm saying if they're doing that work, why would you actually spend your limited resources as much as $50 million is great on that part? Like, is there someplace else to get it? And so the ability to learn at the pace of the fastest learner, wherever they happen to be, like, that is the key to survival in this new environment. Being able to connect and find these people. We used to talk about networking all the time and teach students to network. No, this is now what networking is about. It is about finding that person who knows what you need to know as fast as you possibly can, figuring out whether or not it applies, and if it can apply, how you adapt it and get it incorporated in your environment as fast as possible. That ought to happen most easily here, but there are lots of people out there that can do things that, as you know, could contribute, and you may want to figure out how to invite them in.
Okay. So I'm going to open this up to questions in just a moment, but want to raise a culture issue.
Sure.
Because our institutions individually and collectively we got very thick cultures.
Sure.
And one of the elements of our culture around the faculty member is that sort of sage on the stage, that fount of knowledge, we know best. One of the cultural challenges we are facing at UNCF as we engage with the corporate world is we're taking not just students into the new businesses, but we're taking our faculty, and we've got 31, some of them represented by faculty here out in at Google this summer. They're 3 weeks into a 6-week immersive program, and I know that it has been full of interesting experiences. In fact, that our faculty are learning that this exemplar of innovation is demanding. It's full of young people who know everything. They want the code taught differently. They're holding them accountable, and there's some real confrontation occurring. How do we deal with that? Is that a good thing? Is that something we need to avoid? Is that something we need to?
I think it's like a false question of, is it something to be avoided, right? I mean, the reality is you're preparing your students to go out into this world. Google is at the top of the game. Facebook, you can name the companies. They can get whoever they want from wherever they want them. They are at times setting the standard for everybody who comes behind them because they can. And so being able to engage with them and see where, as they say, the puck is headed from Google's eyes is a huge, huge opportunity. That said, they know they have a problem, right? They know that, when they talk about diversity and inclusion, that they are nascent, and they're trying to figure it out. And they are just figuring out what it means to be inclusive. So there's going to be friction in that context, guaranteed. There's going to be things that they're going to think are right, and they may be. What I would say is that's why it's the pace of adaptation, because you heard my business background. The one thing that's true is people steal ideas in business all the time. That's what happens. Somebody has a good feature, you figure out how to do the feature. I can't do it the way you did it because you may have a patent on it. I figure out how I want to do it. And by the way, I do it a little bit better than you did because I did it a little bit different. So that's how these opportunities are. The Google opportunity is, that was a really great idea. I got a slightly better version of it. Now, you set the standard. You're the big player. So I'm going to play the way you need it to be played in order to play, but I'm going to give my thing a little bit of advantage. And over time, we'll see. That's the hard thing to figure out. And I will say, this is not an HBCU issue. This is a higher ed issue. It is a higher ed issue. The company I work for, 2U, partners with name brand universities, Georgetown, USC, Northwestern, to take their top graduate programs online, right? And the CEO of that company had this line. He said, one of the presidents told him, the story of higher ed is the story of a turtle being mugged by two snails, right? and when you get into a university and you say, think about this, like this is what this is, your top rated program, Georgetown Nursing, yeah, you should have an online program. An online program? And when this company started, like, that was heresy. You're a top-rated program. You do not take it online. Like, that is a signal of poor quality. And fast forward 8 years later, every board is like, what is your online strategy? What are you doing now about online? And oh, by the way, the online students are rating the program more highly than the students who are on campus. And when they designed it, it comports with all the research, but you know how they got there? They didn't know, it was really interesting. They did not really know much about the research, but they focused on how do we make this successful for the student? How do we make it really, really amazing experience for the students? And when they did that, turns out what makes sense kind of lines up with what the science says. Like, this change is going to be hard on everybody. As I said at the beginning, some institutions aren't going to make it. And there are two reasons they're not going to make it. One is they're not willing to do what it takes. Actually, I take that back. There are 4 reasons that people fail at something big like this. One is always the first question, which is, what do you believe? And either you don't believe, and I heard a president of a top university say at a meeting, which I won't name, but with a guy who makes his living bringing the internet to industries that are not expecting it. Like Lilly has created a multiple billions, tens of billions of dollar company disrupting industries. Yeah, the online thing's just not a real factor for us. People still want that. So we believe that, or you don't believe in what the picture I drew about how people can perform. And you think that if you can play that scarcity game that you're going to win. Now, you're not in that game, but that's one of the reasons. The second question, though, is always, what are you willing to do? This change is going to be hard. It's going to be extraordinarily difficult. The faculty issues are one part of it. New capabilities, using this technology. There's a company I was advising when I got started. They have a technology that takes the financial aid process, reduces 98% of the errors, reduces 90% of the human contact required. Think about the implications of that for your institutions. What would that look like rolling something like that across your institution? Might be good, but imagine that change process and those conversations on campus. Third is like, what do you actually know how to do? And there are many institutions that will set out to do this work really gung-ho and will try and do it with limited information, and they'll fall up short. If you can't shoot for the right horizon because you don't know that it's there, or you can see the horizon, but you don't even have a good guess at how to navigate your way there, you all know that's a recipe for disaster. And the last one is just execution. Can you execute? And execution is the killer for everybody, which is all the more reason why you want to find ways to find who's the best at that, whatever that happens to be that day, and see if they can lean in and you can do it together. Like, de-risk, 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 because the entire environment is just one big risk.
Wow. All right. Give him a hand. Now you ask questions. We've got about 10 minutes, I think. Anybody got a question? All right, wait, okay. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Hello, I'm Eddie Moore.
President Moore.
And in your monologue, you put up a chart that showed how society is thinking,
Yeah.
which I can't argue with. The people at the extreme right like being at the extreme right, left, right, as you face the chart, and they're protecting it. But during this discussion, you talked about, I think it was Carnegie Mellon, it really doesn't matter, and how they analyze progress in a classroom. Society is teaching our children, my children, that you need to separate from the middle. And it seems as though what you were describing at Carnegie Mellon is, no, we all need to be at the middle. I couldn't reconcile.
Oh, sure.
I like what Carnegie Mellon's doing, but I couldn't
Yeah,
reconcile it with
let me try it one more time. So, remember they were on that chart. There were two curves. Okay, so what I basically said is the question is, can you get everybody into a much narrower curve at a much further point to the right? Which means basically, in our language, what if everybody could get an A? What if that was the basic expectation, right? And that meant that they had mastered it as completely as it can be mastered. Like, what if that was the case? So the first step in that direction was what Carnegie Mellon did. And what they said is, hey, if we can figure out how to get at least as good as what we get, many of them beat their prior performance, most of them actually beat their prior performance at a significantly lower cost, then we can decide what to do with those resources. And so some of them, you provide additional tutoring and support. Some of them, you say, we're going to recruit that and give the cost savings back to the student. There are lots and lots of different things. But the question is, can you make the middle so far to the right that everyone is succeeding? Okay.
I still believe society wants us. Part of what they expect of us is to do part of that separation. I'm not saying it's right.
All right, well, now this is questions, because we got to let others.
All right, but I'm not positive on it. So there is a sorting function that education plays today. It plays it in K-12, it plays it in higher ed, it plays out across the system, and it plays out within the individual universities. I don't particularly, let's put it this way, I take that as a given. We're operating in the context of society as it exists today. What I'm saying is that the only way to change that is to shift our performance level to a point where it makes it irrefutable. The question is, can we do the equivalent of breaking the 4-minute mile? Once you do that, then everybody knows it's possible, and they have to change their belief set. So now you got college students, literally every meet breaking the 4-minute mile. That is not just from better nutrition. Like, it's a shift in mindset. Can we shift the mindset by performing at a very different level than we have? And can we do it with a population that people don't expect to see do it? And once you do that, like, you've changed the game. Now, that's aspirational, but that's why I do what I do.
Yeah. Excuse
Somebody
me.
here had a hand up, but go ahead.
James, what private school did you go to in D.C.?
I graduated from Gonzaga.
I went to St. John's, bro. We were rivals.
Yeah.
And when I was playing high school basketball, we smoked y'all every time. Okay? Now, I want to come to your notion of scale. James Anderson, Chancellor at Fayetteville State, North Carolina. And I'm a big fan of Michael Crow at Arizona State. I'm a big fan. The schools you mentioned are all major resource universities.
Yep.
And yes, we do need HBCUs to start moving to scale. But my friend Glenda Glover, raise your hand, Glenda, who's the president of Tennessee State, when we make SACS visits to institutions to help them out if they're on warning or probation, absolutely everyone, the first thing we find is they're teetering on financial instability.
Yep.
It's very difficult to make a quantum leap to scale when you're just trying to reach a SACS standard or just trying to have some stability. So I don't know if Ed is in here, but what I would like to see, Michael, partly this institution do is maybe have a session at some point on moving to scale from different points where institutions are. those that are really teetering, those that are pretty close, et cetera, because I think that would help the design thinking somewhat. The second point is scale presupposes certain things. It presupposes you have resources. It presupposes you have capacity. It presupposes you have the leadership that's going to drive that change and that movement to scale, et cetera. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Okay. So just help us understand when those three things are needed, capacity, resources, the kind of transformational leadership, et cetera, how HBCUs can begin to move towards those three before they can jump to scale. Because I agree with you totally. You know, if you're not in this room, if you're not headed towards a strong online model, I already know your enrollment's going to decline within 3 to 4 years. I already know that. Everybody knows
All
that.
right, well, you now answering your question.
No, I gave an example of what happens
All right,
when
but
you don't do those
but
things.
he got to respond.
I'm happy, like.
Yeah, I know you are. I want
Here's what I would say. I mean, the reality is that I've never been in any context where Maslow's needs didn't still hold, right? Like, if, at individual level, institutional level, if you are starving, it is very hard to focus on anything else. The challenge is that that is often what demands the most innovation, right? And that if you can be thoughtful about how to begin to transition the model so that becomes a way for you to have a different financial structure than you have today, it can be a self-fulfilling opportunity. Now, what that usually means is you have to start with partners who can bring capacity that you do not have yourself. And you have to do, like I keep talking about this collective work, because if you try and do it all yourself, the likelihood of success is very low. And so if you can find ways to aggregate talent, aggregate capital, I mean, I'll just talk about it as a philanthropic investor. Like, point blank, when I talk to my peers about historically black colleges, many of them are giving grants in the hundreds of thousands. Millions is a big opportunity. You'll hear, like, you know, I have a hard time deciding which one because I don't want to, like, you spread a few $100,000 around to multiple universities, like, that's going nowhere. But that's what happens. You know, I gave $50,000 here and there. And so if I choose one, though, I get in trouble. So then they move on and look for someplace else to go. But if there was a collective opportunity for investment, the likelihood of investment, I think, goes up because the leverage is there. And the likelihood of success goes up. Like, philanthropists in the end, I mean, there are still folks out there who are just doing nice things. But for the most part, they may not say it this way, but they think of themselves as philanthropic investors. How am I going to get the social return that I'm looking for out of this dollar? And where can I place it that I have the highest potential for that return? And so if you create a context where someone sees a big opportunity for impact, which I think, frankly, by coming together, you have actually begun creating that context. Like, I think you have a huge opportunity to attract investment capital that can let you get a head start on these other pieces. This is, I hate to say it, a turnaround story, right? Under-resourced institutions, by and large, trying to make a giant leap in performance that lets them reverse the cycle of a lack of resources. That's where we are. And in this environment, I will say there's nothing that tells me that there's anything but more difficult times ahead from the federal level on multiple fronts. Right? Like, that Pell stuff didn't seem that important a little while ago, but it seems real important right now. And lots and lots of pieces to this that look like they're going to go the wrong direction. So I would love to say, yeah, somebody ought to make a really great endowment to stabilize all the institutions while they get ready for the pivot. It's not going to happen like that.
So you've got the first ingredient of innovation. You've got the constraints and the problems. And so now you've got to figure out what to do with them to create the innovation. Yes, David.
I'm conscious. There was a lady over here who had her hand up.
Okay, all right.
And there she is. Anyway, ask your question, but can we come to her next?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Absolutely. She can go first.
No, just go on.
Sorry, go ahead, David.
Okay.
Keep going.
Jim, thank you very much for coming and sharing with us this morning. David Wilson, president of Morgan State University. I have a different kind of question. I'm going to put you on the spot just a little bit. You spoke with us quite convincingly about the incredible experience you had as an undergraduate at Morehouse. And so my question is, if you were to overlay that experience on the rapid sort of change that you're seeing right now in higher ed, what is it that you would change about Morehouse that would create a different kind of culture at the institution? And what is it that you would change about Morehouse? Or I'm not picking on Morehouse, it's just that that's the place where you experience, about the business model. And so what is it you might change about the institution that will shift the culture a bit, knowing what you experienced and all the positive things about it? And then what might you change that might usher in a different kind of business model?
Good question.
Sure. So one, I am completely cognizant of how outdated my experience at Morehouse was. But I will say that from my conversations with students and recent alumni, the experience is not as different as I might have imagined it to be. But I'll preface my comments with that. The first thing I will say is that conversation about look to your left, to your right is a real conversation. Like the head of academic affairs at Morehouse said that to us. Look to your left, look to your right, at least one of you will not be here. You set that expectation at freshman year, it is guaranteed to be true. Setting an expectation that look to your left, to your right, it is your responsibility to make sure that those brothers come with you and you all complete. I would change that. That would be number one. Number two, there are many things I gained from learning to navigate the systems to get basic things taken care of at Morehouse. I am not sure I needed to learn those lessons as well as I did in order to get the benefit of knowing how to navigate tricky systems when I left Morehouse. And so there are things that should not be hard, that should no longer get in the way of students getting basic needs taken care of. And I can say this is true of students. This is not a Morehouse thing, this is across schools. Basic things are still way, way too hard. These things, that I would say is a cultural thing, because there's a badge of honor to be able to cut registration down from 9 hours to under 30 minutes. But it never should have been there in the first place, right? The third thing is students are left on their own often to figure out the path through. I remember even being at Morehouse, I was like, it seems like, and I'm so mad at myself for not doing it. I was like, it seems like I should make a chart of like the whole 4 years and what classes we need to take and all that good stuff. And it'll just be laid out, right? Like, it's so hard to figure out what you're supposed to take every semester. And, if I had just written the program for that then. But I could be not having to ask somebody else for it. Anyway, this notion of being planful with students from the outset and helping guide them to the path, like what does it look like to complete? What's it look like to complete in 4 years? Far too few places where that actually happens. Related to that, I would say that, including me, most people chose what they're going to do completely uninformed about what the possibilities are. Completely uninformed. No idea. I am embarrassed to say I was a computer science major who went to Stanford University in the middle of Silicon Valley, graduated in 1993, and went into consulting. My classmate who could not get a job got a job as an analyst at a firm, small startup, that later became Yahoo. Okay? And it was because I did not know. I just did not know. I had done some homework, I'd been exposed to some things, but I did not know. And so the opportunity to connect and engage, the beautiful thing about Morehouse and HBCUs is the shared experience. The risk is the limited experience, right? The lack of exposure to people whose parents did certain kind of things, who worked in certain kind of industries, who already had internships working in certain places. Like, that risk is extraordinarily high. So the question of how do you expand the boundaries of what students see as possible as quickly as possible? Like, that's a big deal. I mean, I remember getting to Stanford, and I still missed it, but I remember talking to a guy first year week during orientation, and he told me, I picked up that he was already rich. I was like, okay, so he's just here kind of exploring. And I asked him how he got his money. He got it syndicating old US television shows to Eastern Bloc countries. I was like, that's a thing? Right? Like, right? So that exposure piece, and so this is the thing for me, like, none of those things change the heart or the character of the institution. Okay. Now, here's the thing I'll say, and I'll end so we can get another question in. One of the things people get scared of when they talk about technology is that you'll lose the heart of the institution, right? And I want you to just think about 2, maybe 3 things. One is I want you to talk to young people, and I want you to ask them how many people that they feel close to have they actually never been in the same physical space with. People form relationships now in very different ways, and they are intense. And because of that, like, the way we conceive of how people form and how they build relationships and how you instill culture is just different. And we have to be open to that. Now, we're still humans. Like, human contact still matters. Being together still matters. The social gateway to learning is still the most powerful gateway. What I'm saying is that the ways in which you create that, and can create that now, are entirely different. Now, I'll tell it through the example I have of working at 2U. One of the things that made me comfortable going to the company, an online company taking graduate students online, is I went and I got the opportunity to see a student panel where they were talking. And each student referred to the experience, of this blended experience, mostly all online, as intimate. I'm like, intimate? What do you talk about? I'm like, well, the way they designed it, I don't know how many of you have used like a Google Chat or something like that, or Adobe Classroom. Like, you're face-to-face with like 12, 13 people and a faculty member or teacher assistant. When was the last time you sat in any classroom face-to-face with 12 of your students or the faculty member for your class session, where they had any idea what you knew before you walked in the room and actually cared and called you out on it? Oh, by the way, that 12 people on the screen means if you are like looking down, texting, or off to the side or whatever, like, I can call on you. Like, I can see it. It's clear. It's right in front of me. And the data from what you did before you came in is right there in front of me. Oh, by the way, now that these are new students, what do? What's the first thing they do when they enroll in the class? Everybody, like, they have a social network that is wrapped around the entire thing. But what else do? Swap LinkedIn, Facebook, and cell phone numbers constantly. Sharing information. And in that context, they all know they're working on top of going to school, so they have an extra incentive to be collectively bonded together to support each other. The way that they describe, so they have these things then they do on campus where people then come and have a shared experience. And the company tagline used to be, you knew it was successful when it was hugs, not handshakes. You know, meet somebody you've never met in person before, doesn't matter. Big hugs. Big hugs, because what? They form that relationship even though they were online. Met a woman who took her courses at 52 years old, who now has her 2 best friends she's from Utah, best friend in Georgia and Washington State from the program. 15 years and 20 years difference between them. The world is changing. The way you create context, the way you do the things that make your school unique can change as well and still not lose what is essential to its essence. You just got to be open to it.
Wow. we have, I think, squeezed a lot out of Jim this morning. I want to thank him for being so generous with his time. And I want to thank him for setting the table for today, tomorrow, and Wednesday. I think you've told us how consequential this work is, how engaged we have to be to make it come to life the way it has the potential to come to life. And I think you've also shared with us the opportunity for us to leap over our own limitations and become leaders in this if we will squeeze every ounce of possibility out of this experience, individually, institutionally, and collectively. So thank you very much. Let's give Jim Shelton a big hand. And call upon our student leader.
Again, just another round of applause.
Sydney Burton from Boston.
Thank you very much.